Good afternoon. Welcome to this live webinar hosted by Albany Law School's online graduate programs. I'm Tom Rosenberger, the Assistant Dean and Director of Online Programs. Today's webinar is part of our HR in Practice series. The topic, Re-Humanizing Organizations Through Employee Wellbeing, blends organizational development, employee well-being, and the legal profession, and we're excited for this. Just before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. The closed captioning option is available on the webinar, and you can see the controls at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post the recording on social media, including LinkedIn. Albany Law School shares a wide variety of events and programs. For example, our Women's Leadership Initiative events, breaking issue analysis and perspective from our faculty, as well as projects and opportunities from our in-house public interest law firm, the Justice Center. So be sure to follow us on social. For today's webinar, the Q&A function is available in case you have a question that you think will add value to the conversation. Some topics may be sensitive, so we want to let you know that we have allowed anonymous questions to be submitted in the Q&A. And in addition, Libby and Joelle, our speakers, have generously agreed to stick around at the conclusion of the event to have more of an intimate Q&A if folks are interested in that. And finally, when you leave the webinar today, please do fill out our survey to help us plan for better and more engaging, not that this one's not engaging, more exciting events that our audience loves to watch. So we want to know what you want to see, what professional development you need ongoing, and the law school is committed to providing that. So please do fill out our webinar. This event is put on in conjunction with the Capital Region HR Association, recognized by SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, as well as HRCI. And we will be sending out via email within the next few days professional development certificates to those who attend. And the Capital Region HR Association offers opportunities for learning and networking through their weekly newsletter, events, and a whole lot more. You can contact them. The information is there on the screen. One last thing related to today's event, Albany Law School offers a number of fully online graduate programs that serve professionals looking to advance their careers, including the program in HR, Human Resources, Law, Leadership, and Policy, which is aligned with SHRM. Our graduate programs are not just for lawyers. Courses provide a legal and regulatory and policy perspective on an industry in which you may already be working. Our programs are designed for flexibility with the adult learner in mind who may be looking to fit an advanced degree into their existing life schedule. Our courses take a practical approach, and our faculty are current industry professionals whose experience, connections, and personal insight are among the things our students tell us they value the most. And just real quick, our other graduate programs, masters for non-lawyers as well as LLMs, are in cybersecurity and data privacy, financial compliance and risk management, health law and healthcare compliance, and a new one coming in 2022 is government affairs and advocacy. And one last point I'll make is if you submit a completed application, we're able to waive the application fee at this time. And if you happen to be an alum of Albany Law's JD program, we're thrilled to be able to offer you a 50% tuition discount on our graduate programs. So without further ado, let me introduce today's two amazing speakers. I know they're amazing because we did a lot of prep. Looking forward to this. Thank you, Joelle Monaco and Libby Carreno, for joining us. Rather than reading your bios, which the attendees can find on the web, I thought we would give you each an opportunity to briefly introduce yourself, your interest around this topic, how you're approaching this topic, and maybe a fun fact to help humanize the room.
Awesome. I'll kick it off. Thank you so much. First, start with gratitude. So thank you, Tom, team, you and Nicole for putting this on. Thank you to all the participants that are signed on today. And thanks so much, Libby, for being part of this conversation with me. I would say I'm a passionate people person. I have 13 years in organizational development and 8 years in behavioral health. So clearly this topic is very near and dear to my passion, but also my heart. And I really find enjoyment in supporting individuals to really lead, but also elevate their organizational culture and really put that people and those operations pieces together. And being that we're talking about well-being, I'm glad that Tommy threw in the humanizing piece because I was going to share this week to maintain my well-being, a few things that I'm doing. I meal prepped. It's a busy week. I'm starting off my mornings with walking, and I'm making sure I'm having dinner with friends. So I'm pretty excited to take care of myself, even though it's a really busy week.
Thanks, Joelle. Thank you. I love starting out with gratitudes too. And I wanted to say thank you so much for participating in this webinar and inviting me to share in the conversation. I find your work inspirational, and I'm so grateful to have you be working in this space. I am a lawyer by trade. I am also a proud Albany Lum graduate, class of a long time ago. No. And I'm really grateful to Albany Law for putting this on. I am a longtime love of lawyers. I love lawyers from the day that I set foot on campus until today. And I believe so much in our ability to humanize the systems in which we work. Lawyers are our society's problem solvers, and we create the framework of regulations, policies, and order moving forward. And I think there could probably be no greater conversation than how we humanize these systems for ourselves in order to bring that to our work and the people that we serve. I am the task force co-chair for the Attorney Wellbeing Task Force for the New York State Bar Association. I'm the co-host of the New York State Bar Association Attorney Wellbeing podcast. And during COVID, I, along with my colleague, Dr. Carrie O'Hara, co-hosted 54 sessions of the Lawyer to Lawyer Wellbeing Roundtable, a confidential resource for discussing all things related to lawyer well-being during the pandemic. So that's my background, and I'm really, really grateful to be here. And in my spare time, I practice law and real estate development.
Thank you both for joining us. And to the attendees, this is going to be sort of a fluid conversational presentation. So I will go invisible, and I will ask Joelle to get things started.
Of course. Thank you. Yeah. Libby and I have had some conversations, and we just felt that, having a natural conversation and kind of with some topics that we wanted to cover would be most natural and that you would find the most value. But again, like Tom said, the chat is open, so feel free to put your questions in there. But what we're going to kick it off by doing is talking about what is well-being, right? It's this topic of conversation that has become so very talked about in the last 2 years. And we really wanted to unpack, what is it? What does it mean? So I'm going to go ahead and share a slide, because sometimes I feel like visuals can support, what the points we're trying to get across. So let me put this slide right up there. And of course, doesn't want to share. Bear with me. Here we go. All right. So when we talk about workplace well-being, there's a variety of different things. And usually what I say is it includes like an organizational health promotion programs. It includes services, it includes policies, health, wellness. And really, when we're talking about a well-being and what is workplace well-being, the goal is to build awareness, it's to educate, and it's also to increase workplace satisfaction and really build organizational success. So a lot of times when we think about it as a nice to have, but what we're finding is in businesses, it's an essential aspect to business development, but also organizational success. And a lot of times, sure, many of you have seen workplace wellness plans, right? And they're one-dimensional, right? It's a walk program, it's a lunch program, it's something that's singular. But when we talk about well-being, it's much deeper. It has many more facets, and because we know a lot of things impact our well-being. So this, and the image, you can see there's a variety of different things that influence and impact workplace well-being. And if we're really thinking as either a leader, I know we have individuals coming as yourself, right? Just showing up to wanting to learn more and take better care of yourself. But we also have leaders, and then we have individuals in the room that might be able to influence change. So if you are, look at these, how do your operations support workplace well-being? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What is the people management? What do your benefits actually include? Are you talking about the 8 dimensions of wellness? And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't include the social determinants of health. I serve on the board of New York State Public Health. So we're always talking about this. What do people have access to? Do they have the food? Do they have transportation? And I know, we're talking in perspective to, students and lawyers with, maybe a lot of student debt, and just trying to make bill, those paycheck to paycheck, make your student loan payments, or worrying about how you're going to pay for it. What can we do as employers, and what can we do as workplaces to really allow individuals to be supported and engaged? And I know, Libby, I'm going to go ahead and pass over to the next slide and get your insight on well-being.
So thanks, Joelle, part of what we looked at during the year and change of the Attorney Wellbeing Task Force was the survey data that came in from New York State lawyers. We actually surveyed over 3,000 lawyers. I think it's the largest survey in New York of attorneys that's ever been done. And it was done in the midst of the pandemic. So we were trying to get a sense of how the pandemic was affecting attorneys. And what came back around the issue of well-being was astonishing. One in roughly between 35 and 40% of attorneys reported having a mental health concern or a mental health incident in the last 3 years. And beyond that, indicated 17% were utilizing substances more so than they had in the past or were concerned about it, but only 7% had ever utilized an employer assistance program. So what we learned here, I think, Joelle, you from a public health perspective, and certainly from a cultural perspective, the concern about that gap, the gap between the pressure on the human being and reporting it, and then the inability or the lack of education. And by the way, I can say it wasn't a lack of education. They were aware of their EAP system programs and their LAP availability, but there is a barrier to entry to using it. Now, I don't know if that's unique to lawyers. My suspicion is it is, but as we've talked about, lawyers always think we are tragically special. So maybe it isn't, but that gap is something I think we all need to be paying attention to, that there's a difference between utilization of benefits and resources and the confidence and security to access them.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I'm going to stop sharing on that note so we can pop out. And I think, what you're saying is 100% not necessarily, in a certain case. Yeah, some of that's unique to lawyers, but I would say that's data and statistics we see across the board, right? Nearly 2 in 5 working age individuals experience a mental health challenge, and that's regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, occupation, industry. But what, the point you spoke to was the gap between, having a diagnosis or experiencing, a mental health challenge or a mental health diagnosis and actually seeking treatment. It's interesting because a lot of times when we're doing data and asking people about an EAP, they don't really know it exists. They don't really know what it is. So it's interesting in that report that so many knew what it was, but didn't actually access it, because a lot of times, to your point, you can have all the benefits in the world, but if people don't know where to find them, don't know what they do, or there's too much stigma, they're not going to reach out, which gets us, I think, to our next rolling point about talking about stigma in the workplace, because, yes, to the point, we can have all of these things. We can have, a lot of availabilities, but what we see in the workplace is a lot of times individuals aren't reaching out because of the stigma associated with either mental health, well-being, substance use. And a lot of times that threads back, if you think about it, workplace, to fear of internal growth, right? Individuals are fearful that what's my trajectory? What's my progression going to be? And a lot of times I say it's not only stigma of others, but internal stigma, right? We think we should be able to handle everything, machismo, like we can carry on with it. But what we see is, our workforce needs that support, but they also need the transparency of leadership sharing stories. And I know, Libby, you're biting at the bit, like to share about, the stigma in the law field. So I'd love to hear from, the surveys and the pieces you did, what that stigma looked like.
Well, that's, I think, the greatest barrier for lawyers for a couple of reasons. One is that not our survey, but Johns Hopkins did a survey a number of years ago of all professions, and indicating that lawyers are the only one do not believe the future will be better than the past. So deeply pessimistic, and there's reasons for how we get trained into that and that kind of thing. But we know that there's this relationship between pessimism and the ability to make change. And because there's just this lack of hopeful future. But with that being said, I think that because of that, the stigma is even more entrenched. It's sort of like, this is the status quo I know, and at least I know I can handle this. It may not be ideal. I may know there's something wrong, but this, at least I'm surviving, right? The problem is, and I think you probably know this, I'm not the clinician, but over time, what we don't anticipate is the series of successive approximations towards more and more pressure, more and more life events. We know that lawyers, the greatest risk for lawyer mental health is between years 11 and 15 in practice. And that's because of this accumulation over time. So you find yourself in year 14, you're an established attorney, and all of a sudden the successive amounts of strain have built up. And the idea of admitting that you can't handle it is debilitating, because lawyers are supposed to have this warlike persona. We're supposed to be all the problem solvers. We don't actually need help ourselves. And so there's this barrier. And then add to that, so that's the help resistance, but then add to it this coupling of talent and mental health. That somehow, if you're having a mental health event, you're less talented. And there is the deep myth, I think. So you have not only the help resistance, but also the mythology that lawyers who have a mental health concern are somehow less talented. And that is coming from their colleagues. That is coming at times from HR. That is a belief from clients that we have to work so hard at decoupling.
Yeah, and a few points you brought up there, the mindset of pessimism, which I'm really excited. We started with gratitude because we know we can influence our mindset, right? There are so many studies around happiness, and it feels a little odd bringing it up in this topic, but it's a lot of working with businesses to say we can influence our mood, we can influence the energy that is happening in a team meeting, depending on what those situations are, by starting the meeting with gratitude, with starting it with wins. And, I'm throwing in some practical approaches here because it makes so much sense. And these are the types of things that don't have to really be outside the box. And when we're talking about well-being, it's not about making things more difficult. It's not a nice to have, but it's integrating and elevating what you're already doing. And, if lawyers are pessimistic and maybe there's a heavy energy in the room because of a case that's being done, like, how do you build in gratitude so that you can influence and change that? Because the other piece you talked about was the year 11 to 15, right? It's the buildup of stress. And we know how burnout works. It starts with stress, it turns into strain, and then it ultimately results in burnout. And when we see stress, it can come from several different things: environmental, our outside world, COVID, civil unrest, right? We've experienced that. We can't really control that. And then there's organizational strain, right? Your workforce, your whatever that is for you. And that can be influenced by employers. It can be influenced by leaders. And then you have individual strain. So it's like these three bubbles, and no bubble can ever disappear, but the allowance that we give each to take up that limited amount of space is a choice that we have to make, right? And if that environmental strain is pushing on us, and then the work, the organizational strain is really filling up that bubble, I could see where the high level of burnout and that strain is going to come from, because if we're not seeking treatment early, we know recovery is so much more difficult. And that just speaks to that, revolving door of how do we get information, because they already have it, but how do we advocate them to actually use it and utilize it? And I think a lot of that comes to the last point you made, really the public health effort of generalizing mental health. It's in all of us, where we talk about it as a continuum. We're never 100% well. We're always managing our wellness, our physical health, our mental health. And we have to contribute. We have to invest in that. It's like your gas tank, right? Like, I drive around in a quarter tank. I can only make it so far. Like, I'm not going to make it to Florida with a quarter tank of gas. And we're the same. So we have to give ourselves a little bit of forgiveness and build that empathy internally, right? Because we're so empathetic for other people, maybe not in, certain industries, but, how do we do that? And I think we talked about this conversation too, and I think it's a great lead in. We have to be proactive. We can't be reactive. We've really been reactive for a long time. We've said, oh, here's a problem, here's a nail, here's a hammer, let me just fix it real quick and move on, and we'll deal with it when it becomes a crisis again. But we've seen that it's more expensive medically, time, organizational investment if we're fixing problems, as opposed to building in supports and resources to take care of people and take care of ourselves, because let's be honest, we're all in this together. Anything, Libby, you want to add to that piece?
Just that, I think for the systemic issue of law in itself, it's what I call sometimes it's systemic entrenchment. It is, I think when I go around and I speak and I talk on these issues, one of the things, when you mentioned education campaign, that is sort of predominant in everything that I go out and speak on, is that this isn't, I said a minute ago, like, we're not tragically unique. That this is something, as you mentioned, that people go through in their lives. And I even have moved away to, I say sort of emotional well-being. In the task force, we called it emotional well-being as opposed to mental health, because even the term mental, if you grew up in the time period I grew up, was a negative connotation. So emotional well-being or emotional resiliency and those types of things, I think they're more accessible messages. And I think that the other part about law that I think lawyers would so benefit from is how they're training empirically, evidence-based affects. Why are so many lawyers pessimistic? Did we just wake up one day and law schools just recruit the most pessimistic people on the planet? No, nope. Doesn't happen. So the research shows we're trained into pessimism because we're professional worriers. We actually create the worst possible scenarios in our mind, then we run them for our clients, and we back out of it and protect the client from that. So we have this professional worry that can take over our brain. I mean, we don't have a separate part of our brain that goes home to our children or our spouse or our dog. That brain is coming with us and has been affected. And so part of it is letting in my industry, letting lawyers know, hey, you're not alone. You weren't born defective. This is something that, happens. And I know some people come to the profession with, predisposed to certain things in genetic, and room for all of that discussion, but there are aspects. And part of what my colleague, Dr. O'Hara, and I work on is, we have this behavioral training for the Humanized Lawyer Project, but basically retraining some of those skills into balance. So it's about skill development. I know you said that, gratitude practices, policy initiatives, but things that actually are tangible to cross that knowledge barrier, because we know that knowledge is not behavior. So we've got to make that shift from knowing it to doing it. And I think that's skill development. I think that's what you were talking about, is really being able to do that.
Yeah. And I want to jump, because we're also talking a little bit more about data, and, looking at this, I had, kicking around a few things, and we know what we think, right? Because we're talking about individuals, right? Knowing it and doing it. But I think it's also interesting to point out what individuals say versus what organizations are actually doing, because a lot of times we're finding that data is actually a little bit different. And it's interesting, right? Because we think we're doing right by our teams, because, we're speaking about it from the individual perspective and the organizational perspective. So I want to make sure, we cover all of them. But, on average, individuals, more than a third of the working Americans have reported experiencing chronic work stress. Less than half say their employers have sufficient resources to help employees manage their stress, right? So that's the difference between what we think we have versus what the utilization is. And I think, Libby spoke to this, where they have it, it's available, but it's also an access, right? It's people actually utilizing it. It's a utilization challenge. And then on average, 20% of employers report that they offer work-life balance, but only 20% of employees agree, which I think is a huge unpack, right? We believe everybody's talking about work-life balance. Okay, let me be the first. Work-life balance doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. It's a unicorn. It's a figment of our imagination. I call it work-life integration, right? Because there's going to be ebbs and flows. And really, we're people. We're not robots. Like, we don't leave our baggage at the door when we check into work. And I think the last 2 years has really elevated that concept and brought the humanistic piece back to the organization, which is really our goal of today's conversation, to get you thinking that way. But, we don't just turn off. So if we're thinking about it from an integration perspective, yeah, there might be some busy weeks. There might be some busy days. Like I said, today I was on a presentation this morning. It's a busy day, but I know I'm going to have balance somewhere. Like, I'm going to ebb and flow. Like, today might be busy, but tomorrow's a little bit quieter. And I think that's the way we have to think about it. But also, we can't talk about this figment and this, we provide work-life integration, not actually do it, right? Expecting our employees to be on the phones 24/7. And I know, Libby, you have a great example for this, because you gave the example and I've already shared it. So you have to talk about the email signature forgiveness example that you shared with me.
All right, I'm trying to remember the email signature. I think.
So
go ahead.
I was going to say emailing outside of hours and everybody working on different schedules.
Mm-hmm. So part of what I've seen some really talented managing partners do, or I should just say at the supervisory level, is if they're working late or early, or even on the weekends, have a signature line at the bottom of their email that says, just because I'm working doesn't mean you have to be. This is my hours of productivity. And if it feels right for you to answer on Monday, this is not an urgent email. And just that humanizing, just that ability to sort of help the nervous system of the junior associate or the person on the receiving end to say, oh, okay, read it, noted. But, I also know some folks who delay their send until 8 o'clock on Monday morning. So just really being in the mindset of what are some of the things I can do where I don't pass my panic or I don't pass my stress, be the person in the chain that sort of says, okay, I'm not going to add to somebody else's unless it's an emergency. And that's inner work. I think, Jill, you mentioned that, everybody doing their own kind of introspection.
Yeah. And it's challenging because the schedule sends are my favorite thing, right? I am, when I'm not doing work and I'm out for a walk, all of a sudden I'll get an idea and we'll have the best idea and the solution to the biggest problem we've been working on. But I also have to create boundaries for myself to not go down that rabbit hole. So I might send myself an email so that I remember to send it out to my team or to whoever I'm working with, or I schedule a send, right, for an appropriate time, because I know if I stop that creativity or if I don't write it down, I'll probably forget. I'm sure many of you are here, which is why we send emails at midnight. But you have to think about to Libby's point, what undue stress is that causing to other people, right? How is that impacting? And then what's their perception of that? You might think, hey, I'm really passionate. Like, I had a really great idea. But to the last bullet on the slide, a study found that 4 in 10 employees felt that someone cared about them as a person, right? They don't actually, most in the workplace, we don't feel like somebody actually cares about us as an individual. We see ourselves as a mode of completing work, right? We are a tool in the organization's toolbox. We serve our function. And sometimes, sending emails at midnight can seem like, hey, they just expect me to be on 24/7. It's interesting. There's actually a law just passed in, now it's totally going to escape me. I'm going to have to look. It's another country that makes it illegal to email somebody outside of typical business hours. And I know in California, they have some legislation that, guards employees from having to respond. And, you don't need to go that far. Sometimes you might, because there might be people. And I know in the law, in law, there's all different needs of clients, but it's about that integration and finding what's right and treating people. Go ahead, Libby.
There's 2 things I think that if I'm in the seat of HR of a law firm, there's 2 things I think that came out of the data that's incredibly important as it relates to this slide. The first is across every practice area, across every age group, and across every demographic in the state, the number 1 impact to attorney well-being was a lack of boundaries. There was not a difference. And so part of, you said, in this last bullet point about feeling like someone cares about you as a person is boundary work. It's boundary work at the end of the day, because I need to know where I stop and someone else begins. I need to know that I know how to be safe. I need to know that my employer understands my psychological safety, because otherwise I'm a machine. That's why, part of the work that I do with Dr. O'Hara is the Humanized Lawyer Project, because it is about rehumanizing, right? The fact that we have become mechanized and we think of ourselves as machines, that we are the email, we are the computer. We should be able to work in that type of fashion, but we can't. And so I always think the first step is how do I rehumanize so that I can offer it to someone else, my own humanity, and access it as opposed to my mechanization. And so I wanted to bring that up because boundaries is something that's very human as opposed to what a machine might need. And to think about it in that way, it cultivates psychological safety. It cultivates self-worth. It cultivates safety between colleagues and clients. And it is no surprise to me that 3,000 lawyers said it's the thing that they struggle with the most.
And it's interesting because we queued it up. As always, our conversation just keeps flowing. So if anybody wants to stay on for the 6-hour edition, please do. So, it was interesting because we were talking about, there's a huge workforce, fallout. Employers are worried about where to find people. And I know this is across industries, but what I found really interesting is when I pulled the data, right? Everybody keeps talking about, oh, well, we made it through the recession, we'll be all right. This data actually is from, it's federal, so it's national data showing the blip from 2008 to 2009 versus 2020 to 2021. And this shows the amount of individuals leaving the workforce. So where we say, oh yeah, we had, a lot of people resign, a lot of people lose employment in the Great Recession, it is significantly different now. I mean, if you look at those two peaks, and I think, what we saw over the last 2 years, to your point, Libby, was a lot of people recognizing that they wanted to live to work, not work to live. Right? They had that change and they were creating those boundaries. And then they said, wait, what have I been doing for the last X amount of years? Like, I have a life, I have people around me. I want to do things. I want to go places. And, part of me thinks, was this conversation about well-being and how we're treating people in the workplace really a cultivation to people leaving the workplace or choosing different professions because, quite frankly, they've become a machine and they don't see that there's no sustainability, right? You can only do it for so long, no matter how emotionally, strong or, how many supports or how much self-care you build in, there's only so much time in a day. So I think, when we're thinking about this from the perspective as a leader and employer, like, there's financial impacts to people leaving the workforce, and there's financial impacts and societal impacts to people leaving an industry if we're not taking care of ourselves and each other. And I think boundaries plays a big role. Like, we have to create those boundaries for ourselves because we also have to stay true to them, which can be really challenging in some situations, standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to answer this email, or no, I can't go to another meeting. I have to be somewhere else. And I just want to kind of dip into the other topic we talked a little bit about when we're talking about, emotional well-being, because that falls within the 8 dimensions of wellness and mental health. It's included in the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Every employer knows about the ADA. Every lawyer knows about the ADA. But what a lot of times I find gaps are that employers don't realize, or leadership doesn't realize, that mental health is included and protected in the ADA. And now I know, yes, people know all of these resources, they know all of these things, but they're not actually reaching out for them. And a lot of times the gap is they just don't know what a reasonable accommodation is, right? If I'm experiencing high levels of stress and I have anxiety, what's a reasonable accommodation that I could ask for? But also, as leaders, how do we recognize what those are so we know what we can offer to people who might be in need, and do it in a way where it's not saying, hey, I'm going to give you a reasonable accommodation, but I know you have a lot going on this week. Would a flexible work time work better for you? How can I support you? Right? And thinking about it a little bit differently. And I know, Libby, probably the research you did, and in the task force, you're seeing different types of needs or wants. Any insight on that perspective of how leaders?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think lawyers are hypersensitive to this issue naturally because of law and policy and regulations and understanding how it works. And part of what we saw in the survey responses, lawyers were also able to answer open-ended questions. So they were able to provide narrative responses. And when you ask a lawyer to write, they usually say yes. So they told us a lot of things, not the least of which was the ADA in theory and the ADA in practice inside a law firm. And there were a lot of really unfortunate stories to read, and concerns about privacy, concerns about pretextual termination, concerns about enforcement of rights. I might as well just get another job at another firm. What's the point of trying to expose myself and, go through this process? And so you can see this sense of futility, I think is the right word, or demoralization around utilizing those accommodations, because the mythology or the oh gosh, what's the word? I think mythology of the lone wolf, one of the deepest, I call hazing comments that you hear in laws. Well, I handled it. I don't know what's wrong with you. This probably isn't the job for you, And I often say to law firm managers, if you drop everybody into the deep end of the pool and just find out the person who can swim, you don't have a team, you have a bunch of lone wolves.
Yeah, you have one person, which we know alone, what can you do? There's no creativity, there's no evolution, there's no anything.
Well, it's not culture, it's not a team. I mean, so when you say, when I challenge people on this, I say, tell me what you really want. Because if the methods you're using don't create that, then I'm confused about what it is you say that you want. So that's it. And the other thing I'll say is that it really is, I think, for law, this relationship with perfectionism and not making mistakes and malpractice. And again, this coupling mythology that if you have a lawyer with an emotional health issue, that somehow they're at greater risk. And the reality is that's not true. Lawyers who are burning out, lawyers who are working beyond their human capacity, statistically actually pose a greater risk to client and malpractice than a lawyer who's seeking treatment. Just want to put that out there.
We see it. We see an impact on occupational safety, like across industries, and it is an occupational hazard, right? And occupational hazard in someone could get hurt, in that there could be a mistake, there could be something undue passed on to a client. Like, it's an occupational hazard. And I say this a lot of times because then it puts it in perspective where, you're getting it from a different perspective, right? If people are stressed out, or if they're working way too many hours and they're not getting sleep, cognitively, decision-making, creativity, problem solving, like, it's all gone. We know this, like, the impact of taking breaks regularly has on our cognitive ability. So, yeah, breaks are nice and we talk about lunch, but are we actually taking them? Are we modeling the behavior? Because I think that's something too, in the practicality, we can come up with all these great policies and all these great initiatives, but we have to model it too. And I'm just thinking back, because you did make one other point about, individuals seeking almost punitive actions, or in response to maybe coming out or asking for reasonable accommodation. And we do see this across a variety of different industries where people, their certifications will be put into question. Their professional trajectory will be put into question. And that's something we have to get rid of. Like, we understand people that are taken care of perform better. And it's the same. I often say, well, if somebody had a heart attack or, had a stroke, what is your re-entrance program for them, right? There's always a re-entrance program. Well, we'll give them, they could work part-time until they're ready to work full-time, and then we'll transition them back. And when we have them back in the office, everybody goes up to them and welcomes them back. Right? Everybody's like, hey, how are you doing? It's been so long since we've seen you. So why is it? And I guess, I always say, I heard somebody say at a panel, like, why is it that we keep following these rules? Why is it that we keep following this culture and not questioning, well, why can't we do this for everything? Right. And
I think that's my, I always am fascinated when we use a physical, I'll call it physical health, even though I don't think there's a define, but manifestation of stress, because I think, heart issues can be a physical manifestation. And we use that as sort of this contrary example to try to sort of draw the comparison. And part of what I always want to do is bring those back together and say, we have such a habit of pointing a finger at the individual without ever asking ourselves, what's the environment that's causing these manifestations? Mm-hmm. So, if I'm having a heart attack, what is the stress that's happening in my life that in this environment that I work in, or the way that I work, as opposed to just looking at the individual. I think part of the baseline of stigma is that the human body does exactly what it needs to do to survive. So humans are doing and acting and behaving in ways that they need. And so if we're going to be organizational leaders and we're going to be looking at the environment that we create, I think I shared this when we met for the first time. It's like sending someone out to an Arctic expedition and getting them out onto the ice shelf and then saying, but we're going to take your coat. And we would think that that was inhumane. We'd say, oh my gosh, how could you do that, right? But this hypervigilance, this need to be always on, this anticipatory anxiety that's trained into law. Well, now you say, I need that to survive this environment, right? And you say, oh, I'm going to take away your anxiety. We're going to do, well, have you made somebody less able to survive your environment? And that's where I think employers have an obligation to look at their mythology and their entrenched policies and the things that reinforce needing those coping skills.
Yeah, and I think this, leads, to another point of the conversation that we talked a lot about is we have to invest in research and development around human capital. Like we really have to invest. We put research and development into every product and every, policy and everything we put out, but how much do we put it into the human research and development, into the human capital? And if we were looking at that from a causal factor, if we have a high rate of hypertension amongst our workforce, of diabetes, right? There's so many correlations where we see all of these impacting somebody's well-being. What research and development are we putting in to say, okay, well, what does our culture, or how does our culture impact or influence these things? And what are proactive pieces we could do? And I think, when we were talking, we were also talking a little bit about triggers, right? And I think that's something that's so important, because when we talk about creating a psychologically safe space, right? That's where people feel engaged and comfortable to bring up tough topics, to talk about sensitive things. But sometimes there might be individuals that have triggered them or said certain things or done certain things that create a space that's not comfortable. And I think one of them, you said was, if you can't handle it, get out, right? How many times do we hear that? Like, if you can't handle the heat in the kitchen, get out. But how much heat everybody can handle is different. And then how much heat everybody can tolerate is different. I just want to create space, anything. And
I'm just thinking, I think I end up listening to you and like not as an audience member. I'm like, oh, that's really good. And I forgot. But I totally agree. I think that, from my perspective, this is what Dr. O'Hara and I call the invalidating environment. You don't feel what you feel. You don't see what you see. You don't think, and you don't know what you know. Let me tell you how you think, feel, believe, and see, right? And there is nothing that will disconnect someone faster from their authentic self, the person you hired, than doing that. And so we look at like why that might be. Why do we have the need to take people's reality from them? Why do we have to? And it's usually because we can't manage our own internal distress about whatever is happening, right? So the way that we create humanized environments is we learn to create validating environments. And there is absolutely a method to being able to do that and work with individuals, over time. I think I said it a minute ago. I think the first pilot program that we will ever do on this is in Seattle, starting in February, and working with firms out there in this exact method of saying, how is it that my simple ability to validate the experience of another human being without fixing it, just saying, I see you, and you may be different than me, and what is it that we need to do, are the types of conversations that we're just going to slow down and have if we're going to create psychological safety. I don't know if that's your experience, but I think it's an invalidation issue.
No, 100%. And you said it, you bring in all of these unique individuals, right, that serve all these wonderful purposes, and not for lack thereof, have so many experiences that can elevate your culture. And then you say, well, wait, that's not the way we do it. Here's how you're going to do it. Here's how you're going to solve that problem. Oh, I did that, right? And I say it's a fine balance between empathy and accountability, right? You have to find where that is and be aware. And trauma gets tossed around a lot. And we talked about, even educating your workforce to be trauma informed and trauma aware. And you say trauma, well, you think of, the worst case scenario, but trauma is anything that someone perceives traumatic, right? That could be, when we're talking about high functioning cultures, that could be losing a case, right? That could be traumatic. We have students in Albany Law on today's call, I'm sure. High achievers, getting a B could be traumatic. It doesn't mean that that's not something that I would perceive, but I'm able to understand and recognize that's your experience. It's not up to me to challenge it, but it's up to me to recognize it, to your point, say, I see you, I hear you, I'm not a professional, but here are resources and here's how I can support you. And I think that's, that humanizing piece that a lot of times we miss, because in our effort to be solvers and fixers, we just want to fix people. We don't want to, it's that fishing analogy, right? Like, teach a person how to fish and they'll fish for life. Like, that's the piece.
But it's also the deep dignity of not believing I know what's best for other people, right? So I may know what's best from a strategic perspective with a client because that's what they're hiring me to do. But that may not be the same case with a junior associate who comes to me with something that they're experiencing. Right? I'm not being paid to solve a strategic problem for them. Right? So we really do have this dialectic, this need to put on different hats at different times so that we can stay human and not be the sort of what we call the dispassionate lawyer all the time. I know I'm focused on those are my people, but I'm just saying.
But even so, you talked about it before, and when we were talking, you were like, we're pessimistic, and it's easy. Like, if somebody tells you about their life challenges, to be like, oh yeah, that's going to be a failure. Don't do it. Too much risk. You were talking about we're risk adverse, right? Like, but I think a lot of people, you're talking about individuals that are lawyers, but I think a lot of people in operations, risk management assessment are the same way, where it's like, oh no, don't do that. Like, and we can carry part of our identity as what we do, right? And then that bleeds into our life. And I know.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah, I know.
There's a quote, it's like, I think it was Cynthia Ocelli who said, people who criticize you or predict your doom are telling their story, not yours. And I think we have to be careful the stories that we're telling each other for our own personal wellness. Angela Sarian, who was a cross-cultural anthropologist, said, we have an addiction to what's not working. We get so consumed with what doesn't work, what's not working in our lives, that we don't have enough healing and empowered conversation. You started it out, sitting down with gratitude. That's one example. What is working? What are the things that are, because we get so focused on the 10% that isn't working that we make it 100%. And so these little behavioral practices to say, whoa, like, can always be telling the disempowering story.
Yep. And, I think this is kind of a great trajectory for the last couple minutes of, today's conversation. I always start by talking about this, if we're talking about ROI, right? Because every business, every leader, they want to know, well, what are we going to get out of it? And when we talk about well-being, for every dollar invested, there's an ROI of at least $4. And that can be seen through people engagement, creativity, reduction of turnover, and reduce use of those reactive benefits that we've been talking about, and leaves. So, as we're talking about this and we're saying, okay, like, what are those practices? What are things we can do to really be practical? And I think, you said it, starting each meeting, right? How many people go into meetings and then it's all the negativity, right? We're just drawn to it. So, like, challenge. And one of the easiest things I talk to people, and I do at most of my meetings, is I start it with wins. Start it with call outs, team call outs, start it with positivity. And I know it seems like real fluffy. Some people on here might be like, okay, Joelle, but if you start with wins, you also see that camaraderie being built across people. And maybe that person that never, because, we know, especially, I'm sure you can give truth to this, Libby, I'm sure many people that were in the survey are the last people to say that they did something really good. They're the last people to say, you know what, I did really good at this. They're always looking at the next project. Whereas if a peer says, hey, Libby really helped me with this. I couldn't have gotten this case closed. I couldn't have gotten this project done without her support. So thank you. You were my MVP. Like, that shows I see you, I care, I appreciate. And that alone can be more than what a financial bonus,
Yeah, I tell lawyers all the time, we are fantastic deconstructionists. We are trained to break everything down into small parts, slow the scenario down, replay the timeline, deconstruct the argument, take everything apart into its pieces. But man, ask us to construct, ask us to put it all back together and see the forest for the trees and be positive. It can be a real challenge because it's just not in our need. So again, it's that behavioral consciousness, that ability to become mindful of like, okay, I have to push against how I'm trained. I've got to stretch a different muscle. I've got to exercise in a different way to keep every part of me strong, because we can get so grooved into our pessimistic thinking. That's just my profession, but that's what we can see. And I think, lawyers are notoriously risk averse, and it's just part of what we do. But when we sit down to to the partners table and we're going to have a conversation, we got to put the pessimism down, or we, because otherwise it's, we're not trying the case of each other. We're partners, right?
Yeah, we're in this together.
We're in this together. So it's just a different conversation.
And I think this kind of leads into one of the practical approaches we both talked about from different perspectives, is it's really looking at employee handbook, right? Like, we can do a lot of change and create a lot of change there. Like, can we integrate policies that rehumanize our organization in our policy book, right? We can list benefits for mental health. We can list mental health and emotional health reasonable accommodations. We can list a policy about work-life integration.
But we don't list who we are. We don't list who we are to create the environment that doesn't need those. Not doesn't need, but you said focuses less on the reactive benefits. Mm-hmm. Part of the, I think the sea change, I describe it as old school and new school for law firms. We're going to have firms that are going to be able to identify and recruit as new school versus old school. And part of it's going to be right through that handbook. That's going to say, here's our policy on mistake making. Here's our policy on perfectionism. Here's our policy on boundaries. And those types of conversations that you're going to be able to sit down with an associate coming out of Albany Law School and say, this is how we create an environment that is conducive to help reduce needing these reactive benefits. We have those too, but we went further upstream. We looked at what was polluting the river.
Yep. And I think that,
right.
Oh, no, you're good. Go ahead.
No, that was it. I worked on these with some really progressive firms and just getting creative about where their problems were. What were their employees really saying that wasn't working, especially their junior lawyers and their staff, and saying, okay, whether you want to hear it or not, the problem you have is boundaries, perfectionism, and whatever else it might be. And then creating the antidote for that on a policy level.
And I think what that piece is also highlights is sometimes because we're so ingrained in it, we can't see it. So the utilization of outside resources and having someone come in and look at it and being transparent and honest, because you said it, some are going to stay the way they are. And the same is true for law firms, but it's also for businesses. I say, if you're not evolving, you're going to stay where you are. And at some point you're going to get left behind. And we know individuals seeking employment are looking not only on, what's your salary, what's the job, but they're looking at what do you care about me? Do you care about me as a person? What benefits? How do you give back to the community? How will I be an integral part of my community? So it's more than just a paycheck. It's more than just a job.
There were two heartbreaking examples from the survey. I remember reading them and thinking, it's like late at night, I'm on my couch, I'm like reading these responses and I'm just like, my heart is just breaking. And one of them was how many gym memberships and all these little things that I can't use because I have a supervisor, I have a boss who won't let me leave my desk. So what is the point? That was one. And the other was, if this is my billable hour requirement and I take vacation, right? And I still have to make it up sometime in the year. Do I really get vacation? Or is vacation a joke? And so if we aren't able to hear that as policymakers and really ask ourselves the hard questions, I think you're right. I think those are the firms that get left behind because that voice is getting louder. That's those survey results. Go to that report if you're in law, and you're going to see where that workforce is heading. It's massive.
And I would say, you could also use that report because I've read through it's hundreds of pages, which is wonderful, but there's a lot of great data and I think a lot of transferable skills because it's not universal, right? It's the workforce, it's things, yes, it might be a situational, but how many businesses say, oh, here's all of our great benefits, but by the way, you can't leave your desk, you can't take a break, you have to work, we're going to schedule a meeting during your lunch. So it's those types of things, but I'm going to pass it back over to Tom because I'm sure he's anxious. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Well, I'm going to reach out to you all the time.
Of course, we're going to talk all the time now.
And this is what we do at Albany Law School. We make meaningful connections. No, in all honesty, quick message to the attendees, when we began planning for this conversation between an attorney and a non-attorney, we thought, well, how are we going to blend these two worlds? And I knew in my heart that we could blend these worlds. And I know from this hour together with both of you that the HR or other organizational leaders here with us today definitely heard things from Libby and from the task force side that resonated with them and vice versa. So thank you both for this really enlightening, really inspiring conversation. I think everyone has taken away something from today and we very much appreciate it. Both of you are very busy. You're on social media, you're on LinkedIn though, so people can find you there and follow your great work. And we had said that we were going to allow additional questions if anybody had any sort of more private questions. So what I'm going to do now is stop the recording